And let me tell you that sleep is a misnomer. I mean, sleep actually is a catch-all term for what is really a dramatically diverse collection of different brain states. And they are so different electrophysiologically and chemically and hormonally that they bear very little relationship to one another. They're all a different type of consciousness, in fact. You're not unconscious while you're sleeping.
The Science of Happiness.
Appreciating modern painting.
Dilemmas of modern medicine.
Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War.
The history of jazz.
The artistic genius of Michelangelo.
When intuition fails.
Turning points that changed American history.
The psychology of religion.
The genius of Mozart.
The future of humans.
One Day University. The most acclaimed and popular professors from top colleges, their best lectures, fascinating conversations. Hi, I'm Richard Davies. Let's learn.
The fact that here we are in 2018 and we are still needing this process called sleep, the fact that it has been demonstrated in every single animal species.
My name is Jessica Payne, and the name of my lecture is The Science of Stress and Sleep, How They Affect Creativity, Concentration, and Memory.
Than our ancestors did. In fact, as we build more tissue in the frontal cortices of our brain, which is the most recently evolved part of our brains, we may be actually sleeping a little bit more.
In your One Day University lecture, what do you hope people take away from it?
You know, if there's one thing I'd like them to take away from it, it's understanding that the sleeping brain is highly, intensively active. Because if you go out and you talk to your average person on the street and you ask them, what is sleep? What does it do? You'll inevitably get answers like, well, it's just a time where the brain is sort of switched off and it's recovering. You know, it's rejuvenating. And that's partly true. But what they don't understand is that the sleeping brain is actually busily at work for you. The hippocampus, which is important for memory, the amygdala, parts of the prefrontal cortex, are actually highly active during rapid eye movement sleep. And then there's an actual communication that goes on during non-REM sleep between cortical areas and hippocampal areas, which we know are essential for memory consolidation. So if people respect that they're not wasting time when they're sleeping, that their sleeping brains are actually doing something for them, something important, helping them remember, helping them process emotions, helping them make creative connections, then the last thing we should do is curtail sleep and have it be the first thing to go when we get stressed out and busy. But it should be one of those things we retain because it's where incredible feats of cognitive prowess happen. It's some of our most creative ideas come from, and it's absolutely necessary to truly learn and remember things in the long run.
So when people think about sleep, very often they think about length of sleep. Is that the most important thing, or is it type of sleep?
Actually, it's a little bit of both. So length of sleep is important, although I object to this idea that everybody needs to get their 8 hours.
I just want you to shout it out at me. How many hours, when we talk about sleep, how many hours do human beings need to get at night? Okay, so 8, all right? That's what I'm hearing. And you know something? I'll tell you that that's both true and false. And it's not bad advice necessarily, but sleep, like many human variables, is actually normally distributed. It just turns out that between 7 and 9 hours a night is what the vast majority of us need, somewhere between 7 and 9. But that doesn't mean that you have to, get exactly 8 hours. It's also true there are lucky souls out there who literally only need, and I don't mean can get by on, I mean need 4 hours of sleep, but they are statistically so rare that when somebody tells me that this is what, they need, I don't believe them.
When I meet people who say that they are just fine on 4 hours, usually we look at their performance in the lab, and in terms of objective performance, they're terrible. And when I hear people saying that they need 12 hours, that is possible, but more often than not, it actually raises the specter of sleep apnea.
Tell me about sleep apnea. What is that?
So sleep apnea is a complete cessation of breathing. So each time you have an apnea, you stop breathing, which means that your brain is deprived of oxygen. And every time you have an apnea event, your brain has to wake up or arouse in order to get a breath. And so when people talk about, well, hey, Dr. Payne, I think I might be one of your long sleepers, I think I might need 12 hours. And when I ask them why they think that, they'll say, well, because I'm constantly sleeping a lot and yet I never feel well rested. In many cases, when you look at those people's sleep, the reason they feel that way is because their brains are actually waking up over and over and over again, sometimes up to 100 times or more an hour in severe cases of sleep apnea.
What's really disturbing about this is every time that happens, your brain has to wake up to get a breath. But the person doesn't remember that. So their perception is that they're just sleeping all the time and they never feel rested. You bring them into the sleep lab and you see awakening, 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 awakening. Of course they're exhausted and their sleep is shattered. And the reason I like to talk about this at these events is that we now know that there is a very strong and very real relationship between sleep apnea and heart attack and stroke.
It's very common to hear people say, oh, I only need 4 or 5 or 6 hours of sleep. Does that kind of talk drive you crazy as a sleep researcher?
It does drive me crazy. Well, on the one hand, I find it fascinating, and I'm still looking for that group of people that really are functioning at their best on only 4 hours. When you get to 6, that's a little bit more possible. But yeah, it drives me crazy because where I think that really comes from is this cultural message.
The problem there is that we live in a puritanical culture. We live in a culture where there's this first one in, last one out mentality. There's this idea that, in order to work better, you always have to work longer, right? And, students, they wear their sleep deprivation as a badge of honor. You hear it all the time. This drives me crazy as a sleep scientist. Oh, well, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night because I was studying. Oh, well, I pulled an all-nighter. Well, as a memory researcher, there's nothing that makes me more crazy because the two things you want to do if you want to consolidate memories, which is literally the ability to sort of store them long-term and actually be able to remember them later, you don't just visit something once. You need to actually sort of interleave your practice. You want to revisit a concept over and over again. You don't want to cram. And you especially don't want to cram across a night of sleep deprivation. Instead, you want to be sort of revisiting this concept, and you want to sleep on it right after you study it for the last time. And yet, students across the United States do this exactly the wrong way.
So yes, it drives me absolutely crazy.
What does sleep deprivation do to us? If we are sleep deprived, what happens?
Well, a lot of really bad things happen. Increased traffic accidents, lapses in concentration, to memory impairment over time. I think most of us have experience with temporary periods of sleep deprivation, and our brains are plastic, and we really are rugged. We've evolved to tolerate some amount of sleep deprivation. So I'm not worried about the person who has one poor night of sleep or goes through a difficult patch, or even think about new parents. They're going to go through several months of poor sleep. We're designed to be able to handle that. What I worry about are the people who are doing that for these long periods of time where people aren't sleeping. That kind of sleep deprivation actually builds up. You accumulate what's called sleep debt, which is a pressure that your brain actually has to pay back this debt that it's accumulated.
The more sleep deprived you become, the more your performance is going to suffer, in the same exact way that the more alcohol you consume, the more your performance suffers. And what's interesting is that in both of these cases, people don't have awareness of it. People are not necessarily aware that they're impaired when they're drunk. And people are definitely not aware that they're impaired when they're sleep deprived. You have to bring them into the lab and show them their own data.
So we've all met that person who thinks they're fine to drive after drinking, but we know they're not. It's the same exact relationship for sleep deprivation. And then what I fear, especially somebody dealing with adolescents and people in college, is when you mix those things, you can get into a really deadly situation. So if you have even a little bit of alcohol, but you're sleep deprived on top of it, then your risk for traffic accidents and a whole host of other mistakes skyrockets.
So how do you know if you're sleeping well or if you're getting enough sleep?
There are two ways I can answer that question. The first is if you feel like you're at your best. Most of us have a sense of when we're at our best. And one way to look at that is to do what I urge everybody to do, which is to put 20 extra minutes of sleep into your daily routine, which most of us can benefit from, even people who are sleeping pretty well. And if that makes you feel better, makes you feel happier, more positive, then that's one way to tell. But the real answer is, I think we should have a sleep study done. This is where you go into a sleep laboratory. There are physicians that are trained in sleep medicine. And I think everybody ought to get a baseline when they're, say, 25 years old, so that we actually have an objective measure of how we're sleeping. so that we can screen for things like apnea, so that we can address insomnia before it gets bad and difficult, because that's in part a learned cycle that can be very difficult to undo. And it blows my mind that when you go to your doctor, that's not even a question most physicians ask, is how are you sleeping? Which is crazy in my mind, because sleep is a real barometer of health, both mental and physical health.
Talk about naps and why you think they're important.
Yeah, I actually think we never should have stopped napping in kindergarten.
The first thing that I really want you to try to do, this is the single most important takeaway, is just try to get 20 extra minutes a day on as many days as you can. And there are 3 different ways to do that. You can either go to bed earlier, you can sleep later, meaning don't hit the snooze button, which is a very bad idea, actually. Just let your brain stay locked in. But you're going to get the most bang for your buck if you start to incorporate daytime napping. But the idea here, okay, is that when it comes to napping, you do not want to nap any longer than 20 minutes. And I mean set your alarm for 20 minutes, because I don't even want you to sleep that long, because if you're sleep deprived and your brain's built up the sleep debt, you're going to run the risk of going into slow wave sleep. And if you wake up out of that, you're going to be groggy, feel terrible. It's not going to help.
Napping is a great way to recharge your brain in the middle of the day. And depending on the length of the nap, you can do anything from boosting memory and cognition to rejuvenating the brain and cleaning the cache, if you will. I'm a big advocate for nap pods in corporate culture, because people we know that they perform better if they're able to get even a very brief nap. I envision a world where one day, somebody told me recently that they could get fired. It's in a contract that they could get fired for sleeping on the job. And that, to me, it's just so backward. I imagine one day companies will want to actually harness the power of the sleeping brain. So if you can imagine people in their cubicles with little signs that say, sleeping brain at work, innovation in progress, that's the world I imagine, where it's okay to go offline, whether that's taking a 20-minute nap or just getting out for a relaxing walk or reflective walk or doing a meditation or relaxation exercise. All of these ways of taking the brain offline actually allow the brain to perform better, and people will be much more productive, not to mention happier and just in a better mood.
You make a really compelling case for sleep helping your creativity, helping your memory. What about emotion? Does it help regulate your emotion, calm you down?
Sleep absolutely helps regulate emotion. In fact, it's a built-in stress and emotion regulator. So as I just mentioned, if you're sleep deprived, if you're not getting enough sleep, that is a stressor. Your body will secrete stress hormones like cortisol. When you're sleeping, that system gets regulated, number one. And number two, it doesn't just calm you down, but it regulates the way that you process difficult and negative things that happen during the day. So we like to think of sleep doing two things for emotional experiences. Sleep actually helps you remember the emotional, even the negative, which if you think about it, you need to do because you need to be able to learn from your mistakes. It's also incredibly adaptive at a species level. But you also want sleep to help strip away the emotional tone of that experience.
The amygdala is incredibly important for emotion, and especially for negative emotions like fear. Also more active during sleep than wake, which is both good and bad, right? Like you need to process emotion in order to be healthy, but you don't want to process it without also regulating, which is why it's also a good thing that parts of your, what we call medial prefrontal cortex, okay, here in the front of the brain, there's a region within that called the anterior cingulate. Its job is to literally put a brake on the amygdala. So they kind of talk to each other, and when the amygdala gets out of control, it breaks it so that you don't actually get out of control in terms of your emotions. So there's a crosstalk going on between these two structures that allow you to process emotional experience that you've had, but while also regulating it, okay? Well, what I like to say about this in terms of memory, for example, is you don't want to forget all of the negative experiences that happened to you because you'd never be able to learn from them. You need to be able to remember the most negative things from your life, but you also need to regulate the negative emotion that comes along with that so you don't develop an anxiety disorder, right? So that you don't develop depression.
So you're not only processing your emotions and your emotional experiences, but you're regulating your affect or your emotion to them. So that's one of the reasons we think that many actually mental health conditions and definitely affective disorders like depression and anxiety are often associated with sleep deficits.
In your lecture, you talk about memory, and I know that as people get older, especially over the age of 50 or 60, they worry about, will I suffer from dementia? Will I be someone who gets Alzheimer's? Is there any relationship between getting your 8 hours a night and lowering your risk for dementia?
Well, again, it's early days. As a scientist, I like to see data replicated over and over again. But there is a link. It's preliminary, but it's an important one. There are two lines of evidence that suggesting there's a correlation there. One, it is true that people who have a history of poor sleep are at higher risk for developing dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. So we've known that for a long time, that there's a link there. Now, that's just a correlation. Correlation does not imply causation, but that's one link. The other link is new research showing that you need to get sleep, especially deep slow wave sleep, which again is the deepest stage of sleep you get, in order to literally clean out the brain. So your brain produces metabolite, right? I mean, as you go about your day-to-day, your brain is working away, and all the byproducts, all the waste of that metabolism needs to get cleaned out somehow. Beta amyloid is one of the waste products that needs to get cleaned out of the brain. So when you sleep, when you achieve especially the deep slow wave sleep, that's so important also for memory consolidation, you're also getting the benefit of cleaning out what's called the interstitial space. So cleaning out the spaces in the brain. You can really think about it as cleaning out the gunk, or taking out the trash. And sleep is clearly linked to the ability to do that. So if you don't clean out the beta amyloid, the problem obviously is that is what causes the plaques. That's what the plaques are made out of. And that's one of the defining characteristics of Alzheimer's disease. So I'll say they're preliminary, but I think that this is a very interesting line of work that's going on now, looking at poor sleep and its relation to dementing diseases on the one hand. And of course, you can flip that. Are good sleepers at much less risk for dementing diseases? And those data are coming. And as I said earlier, it takes a long time and a lot of replications for me to become convinced of something, but that's certainly a story I'm paying attention to.
I like that, cleaning out the gunk, taking out the trash. You talk about how good sleep helps creativity. In what sort of ways?
There are a whole host of different theories about that. And the truth is we don't know exactly how it works. We do know that it does. So it's very clear that sleep is one means to reach creative insight. There have been many studies showing that. I can tell you what I think is going on, and this is shared by other sleep neuroscientists, is that during sleep, especially during rapid eye movement sleep, you have areas of the brain communicating in ways that they simply don't during wakefulness.
And I just can't resist it. I have to tell you that there's another area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it is completely deactivated. It is literally switched off during rapid eye movement sleep. And what's fascinating about this is that this structure of the brain, we literally call this the executive control center of the brain. It is the CEO of the brain. Yet it's a very sort of literal and linear CEO. This is not a CEO who thinks outside of the box. Okay, we're going to do it in exactly the same way we've always done it. This is logical. This is rational. It's also good though because it tells me I can't walk through that wall and I can't fly out to the back of the room. So this is good, right? However, it also keeps you kind of contained in terms of your creative thinking. So during rapid eye movement sleep, with it being switched off, all the while you're doing all of this cognitive and information processing, you're allowed to kind of run amok and have ideas and activate neural representations and combine them in new and novel ways in a manner that you simply can't do when you're awake. And this is one of the reasons why people have aha moments when they wake up from sleep.
So it may be that all of these different modes of communication, all of the ways that your memories are being processed, the information that you've learned in the past is being processed in REM sleep is occurring in a way that's really different than the way it occurs during wakefulness or even other stages of sleep. And because of this regional pattern of activation that occurs only in rapid eye movement sleep, it really allows us, we think, to take different types of information, different fragments of memory, and recombine them in totally novel ways. Now, does that lead to the completely bizarre, fragmented nature of our dreams? Probably. But those dreams may be a byproduct of a process that's incredibly important because it can also, at least at times, lead to creative connections, lead to insights, and really just new novel ways of looking at things. So the best thing to do if you are at an impasse, if you're trying to solve a problem and you're at an impasse, you're stuck, is to take the brain offline.
So in other words, if you have a big decision to make, that phrase, go and sleep on it, you should take that literally.
You should take that literally, whether it's a good problem, like you're trying to decide which job to take, an emotional problem, like how to deal with an issue you're having with your spouse or your child. And even if you're trying to achieve creative insight, one of the best things you can do, you have to put the hard work in, but then go offline, take that break, and ideally get some sleep.
That's a great way to end. Jessica Payne, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm Richard Davies. One Day University brings together the greatest professors from the world's top schools to present specially crafted versions of their best lectures live. There may well be a One Day University event happening soon near you. Discover more on our website, onedayu.com. And thanks for listening.